Chapter number 2 of The Altar of the Dead by Henry James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Larry Kaplan. He had this year, on the eve of his anniversary as happened, an emotion not unconnected with that range of feeling. Walking home at the close of a busy day, he was arrested in the London street by the particular effect of a shop front that lighted the dull brown air with its mercenary grin, and before which several persons were gathered. It was the window of a jeweller, whose diamonds and sapphires seemed to laugh in flashes like high notes of sound, with the mere joy of knowing how much more they were worth than most of the dingy pedestrians staring at them from the other side of the pane. Stransom lingered long enough to suspend, in a vision, a string of pearls about the white neck of Mary Antrim, and then was kept an instant longer by the sound of a voice he knew. Next to him was a mumbling old woman, and beyond the old woman a gentleman with a lady on his arm. It was from him, from Paul Creston, the voice had proceeded. He was talking with a lady of some precious object in the window. Stransom had no sooner recognized him than the old woman turned away, but just with this growth of opportunity came a felt strangeness that stayed him in the very act of laying his hand on his friend's arm. It lasted but the instant, only that space sufficed for the flash of a wild question. Was not Mrs. Creston dead? The ambiguity met him there in the short drop of her husband's voice, the drop conjugal, if it ever was, and in the way the two figures leaned to each other. Creston, making a step to look at something else, came nearer, glanced at him, started and exclaimed, behaviour the effect of which was at first only to leave Stransom staring back across the months at the different face. The wholly other face the poor man had shown him last, the blurred ravaged mask bent over the open grave by which they had stood together. That son of affliction wasn't in mourning now. He detached his arm from his companion's to grasp the hand of the older friend. He coloured as well as smiled in the strong light of the shop when Stransom raised a tentative hat to the lady. Stransom had just time to see she was pretty before he found himself gaping at a fact more portentous. "My dear fellow, let me make you acquainted with my wife." Creston had blushed and stammered over it, but in half a minute, at the rate we live in polite society, it had practically become, for our friend, the mere memory of a shock. They stood there and laughed and talked. Stransom had instantly whisked the shock out of the way, to keep it for private consumption. He felt himself grimace, he heard himself exaggerate the proper, but was conscious of turning not a little faint. That new woman, that hired performer, Mrs. Creston? Mrs. Creston had been more living for him than any other woman but one. This lady had a face that shone as publicly as the jeweller's window, and in the happy candour with which she wore her monstrous character was an effect of gross immodesty. The character of Paul Creston's wife thus attributed to her was monstrous for reasons Stransom could judge his friend to know perfectly that he knew. The happy pair had just arrived from America, and Stransom hadn't needed to be told this to guess the nationality of the lady. Somehow it deepened the foolish air that her husband's confused cordiality was unable to conceal. Stransom recalled that he had heard of poor Creston's having, while his bereavement was still fresh, crossed the sea for what people in such predicaments call a little change. He had found the little change indeed. He had brought the little change back. It was the little change that stood there, and that, do what he would, he couldn't, while he showed those high front teeth of his, look other than a conscious ass about. They were going into the shop, Mrs. Creston said, and she begged Mr. Stransom to come with them, to help decide. He thanked her, opening his watch and pleading an engagement for which he was already late, and they parted while she shrieked into the fog, "Mind you now, come to see me right away." Creston had had the delicacy not to suggest that, and Stransom hoped it hurt him somewhere to hear her scream it to all the echoes. He felt quite determined as he walked away never in his life to go near her. She was perhaps a human being, but Creston oughtn't to have shown her without precautions, oughtn't indeed to have shown her at all. His precautions should have been those of a forger or murderer, and the people at home would never have mentioned extradition. This was a wife for foreign service or purely external use. A decent consideration would have spared her the injury of comparisons. Such was the first flush of George Stransom's reaction, But as he sat alone that night, there were particular hours he always passed alone, the harshness dropped from it and left only the pity. He could spend an evening with Kate Cranston if the man to whom she had given everything couldn't. He had known her 20 years, and she was the only woman for whom he might perhaps have been unfaithful. She was all cleverness and sympathy and charm. Her house had been the very easiest in all the world, and her friendship the very firmest. Without accidents he had loved her. Without accidents every one had loved her. She had made the passions about her as regular as the moon makes the tides. She had been also, of course, far too good for her husband, but he never suspected it, and in nothing had she been more admirable than in the exquisite art with which she tried to keep every one else—keeping Creston was no trouble—from finding it out. Here was a man to whom she had devoted her life, and for whom she had given it up, dying to bring it into the world a child of his bed. She had only to submit to her fate to have, ere the grass was green in her grave, no more existence for him than a domestic servant he had replaced. The frivolity, the indecency of it made Stransom's eyes fill, and he had that evening a sturdy sense that he alone in a world without delicacy had a right to hold up his head. While he smoked after dinner, he had a book in his lap, but he had no eyes for his page. His eyes in the swarming void of things seemed to have caught Kate Creston's, and it was into their sad silences he looked. It was to him her sentient spirit had turned, knowing it to be of her he would think. He thought for a long time of how the closed eyes of dead women could still live, how they could open again in a quiet lamplit room long after they had looked their last. They had looks that survived, had them as great poets had quoted lines. The newspaper lay by his chair, the thing that came in the afternoon and the servants thought one wanted. Without sense for what was in it, he had mechanically unfolded and then dropped it. Before he went to bed he took it up, and this time at the top of a paragraph he was caught by 5 words that made him start. He stood staring before the fire at "Death of Sir Acton Hague, K.C.B." the man who 10 years earlier had been the nearest of his friends, and whose deposition from this eminence had practically left it without an occupant. He had seen him after their rupture, but hadn't now seen him for years. Standing there before the fire, he turned cold as he read what had befallen him. Promoted a short time previous to the governorship of the Westward Islands, Acton Hague had died, in the bleak honour of this exile, of an illness consequent on the bite of a poisonous snake. His career was compressed by the newspaper into a dozen lines, the perusal of which excited on George Stransom's part no warmer feeling than one of relief at the absence of any mention of their quarrel. An incident accidentally tainted at the time, thanks to their joint immersion in large affairs, with a horrible publicity. Public indeed was the wrong Stransom had, to his own sense, suffered, the insult he had blankly taken from the only man with whom he had ever been intimate, the friend almost adored of his university years, the subject later of his passionate loyalty, so public that he had never spoken of it to a human creature, so public that he had completely overlooked it. It had made the difference for him that friendship too was all over, but it had only made just that one. The shock of interest had been private, intensely so, but the action taken by Hague had been in the face of men. Today it all seemed to have occurred merely to the end that George Stransom should think of him as Hague, and measure exactly how much he himself could resemble a stone. He went cold suddenly, and horribly cold, to bed. End of Chapter 2.